Fall is the best season for ghost stories, and we're going to share one of the most famous ghost stories in American literature right here on Crackling Tales. And welcome to Crackling Tales. I'm Ken Bearden. We're here in the beautiful rooms of the Bacon Memorial District Library to celebrate great stories and great writers. Great stories don't just happen. Someone has to write them, someone has to publish them, and most importantly, people have to share them. We encourage you to share the stories you'll hear here, as well as the ones in your public library, and all the ways they help bring our communities together. Today's story is from Revolutionary American War author Washington Irving, and it's probably one of the most famous ghost stories ever known. The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. In the bosom of one of those spacious coves which indent the eastern shore of the Hudson, at that broad expansion of the river denominated by the ancient Dutch navigators the Tappan Zee, and where they always prudently shortened sail and implored the protection of St. Nicholas when they crossed, there lies a small market town, or rural port, which by some is called Greensburg, but which is more generally and properly known by the name of Tarrytown. Not far from this village, perhaps about 2 miles, there's a little valley, or lap of land, among the high hills, which is one of the quietest places in the whole world. A small brook glides through it, with just murmur enough to lull one to repose, and the occasional whistle of a quail or tapping of a woodpecker is almost the only sound that ever breaks upon the uniform tranquility. From the listless repose of the place and the peculiar character of its inhabitants, who are descendants from the original Dutch settlers, this sequestered glen has long been known by the name of Sleepy Hollow. And certain it is, the place still continues under the sway of some witching power that holds a spell over the minds of the good people, causing them to walk in continual reverie. They are given to all kinds of marvelous beliefs, subject to trances and visions, and frequently see strange sights, and hear music and voices in the air. The whole neighborhood abounds with local tales, haunted spots, and twilight superstitions. Stars shoot and meteors glare oftener across this valley than in any other part of the country. The dominant spirit, however, that haunts this enchanted region and seems to be commander-in-chief of all the powers of the air is the apparition of a figure on horseback without a head. It is said by some to be the ghost of a Hessian trooper whose head had been carried away by a cannonball in some nameless battle during the Revolutionary War, and who is ever and anon seen by the country folk hurrying along in the gloom of night as if on the wings of the wind. His haunts are not confined to the valley, but extend at times to the adjacent roads, and especially to the vicinity of a church at no great distance. Indeed, certain of the most authentic historians of those parts who have been careful in collecting and collating the facts concerning the spectre allege that the body of the trooper having been buried in the churchyard, the ghost rides forth to the scene of battle in nightly quest of his head, and that the rushing speed with which he sometimes passes along the hollow like a midnight blast is owing to his being belated and in a hurry to get back to the churchyard before daybreak. In this by-place of nature, there abode, in a remote period of American history, that is to say, some 30 years since, a worthy man of the name of Ichabod Crane, who sojourned, or, as he expressed it, tarried in Sleepy Hollow, for the purpose of instructing the children of the vicinity. He was tall, but exceedingly lank, with narrow shoulders, long arms and legs, hands that dangled a mile out of his sleeves, feet that might have served for shovels, and his whole frame most loosely hung together. His head was small and flat atop, with huge ears and large green glassy eyes, and a long snipe nose, so that he looked like a weathercock perched on his spindle neck to tell which way the wind blew. To see him striding along the profile of a hill on a windy day, with his clothes bagging and fluttering about him, one might have mistaken him for the genius of famine descended upon the earth, or some scarecrow eloped from a cornfield. His schoolhouse was a low building of one large room, rudely constructed of logs, the window partly glazed and partly patched with leaves of old copybooks. When the school hours were over, he was the companion and playmate of some of the larger boys, and in addition to his other vocations, he was the singing master of the neighborhood, and picked up many bright shillings by instructing the young folks in psalmody. Thus, by diverse little makeshifts, in the ingenious way which is commonly denominated by hook and by crook, the worthy pedagogue got on tolerably enough, and was thought by all who understood nothing of the labors of head work to have a wonderfully easy life of it. The schoolmaster is generally a man of some importance in the female circle of the rural neighborhood, being considered a kind of like gentleman personage of vastly superior taste and accomplishments to the rough country swains, and indeed inferior in learning only to the parson. From his half-itinerant life also he was kind of a traveling gazette, carrying the whole budget of local gossip from house to house, so that his appearance was always greeted with satisfaction. He was, moreover, esteemed by the women as a man of great erudition, for he had read several books quite through, and was a perfect master of Cotton Mather's History of New England Witchcraft, in which, by the way, he most firmly and potently believed. He was, in fact, an odd mixture of small shrewdness and simple credulity. His appetite for the marvelous and his power of digesting it were equally extraordinary, and both had been increased by his residence in this spellbound region. Another of his sources of fearful pleasure was to pass long winter evenings with the old Dutch wives as they sat spinning by the fire, with a row of apples roasting and spluttering along the hearth, and listen to their marvelous tales of ghosts and goblins, and haunted fields, and haunted brooks, and haunted bridges, and haunted houses, and particularly of the headless horseman, or galloping Hessian of the Hollow, as they sometimes called him. He would delight them equally by his anecdotes of witchcraft, and of the direful omens and portentous sights and sounds in the air which prevailed in the earlier times of Connecticut, and would frighten them woefully with speculations upon comets and shooting stars, and with the alarming fact that the world did absolutely turn around, and that they were, half the time, topsy-turvy. All these, however, were mere terrors of the night, phantoms of the mind that walks in darkness. And though he had seen many specters in his time, and been more than once beset by Satan in diverse shapes in his lonely perambulations, daylight put an end to all these evils, and he would have passed a pleasant life of it, despite of the devil and all of his works, if his path had not been crossed by a being that causes more perplexity to mortal man than goblins, ghosts, and the whole race of witches put together, and that was a woman. Among the musical disciples who assembled one evening each week to receive his instructions in psalmody was Katrina Van Tassel, the daughter and only child of a substantial Dutch farmer. She was a blooming lass of fresh 18, plump as a partridge, ripe and melting and rosy-cheeked as one of her father's peaches, and universally famed not merely for her beauty, but for her vast expectations. She wore ornaments of pure yellow gold, and withal a provokingly short petticoat to display the prettiest foot and ankle in the country around. Ichabod Crane had a soft and foolish heart, and it is not to be wondered at, so tempting a morsel soon found favor in his eyes, more especially after he had visited her in her paternal mansion. Old Baltus Van Tassel was a perfect picture of a thriving, contented, liberal-hearted farmer. He seldom, it is true, sent either his eyes or his thoughts beyond the boundaries of his own farm, but within those everything was snug, happy, and well-conditioned. His stronghold was situated on the banks of the Hudson, in one of those green, sheltered, fertile nooks in which the Dutch farmers are so fond of settling. The pedagogue's mouth watered as he looked upon the Van Tassel's farm. It was a sumptuous promise of luxurious winter fare. In his devouring mind's eye, he pictured himself every roasting pig running about with a pudding in its belly and an apple in its mouth. The pigeons were snugly put to bed in a comfortable pie and tucked in with a coverlet of crust, the geese swimming in their own gravy, and the ducks pairing cozily in dishes like snug married couples with a decent competency of onion sauce. In the porkers he saw carved out the future sleek side of bacon and juicy relishing ham. Not a turkey but he beheld daintily trussed up with its gizzard under its wing, and for adventure a necklace of savory sausages. As the enraptured Ichabod fancied all this, and as he rolled his great green eyes over the fat meadowlands, the rich fields of wheat and rye, of buckwheat and Indian corn, and the orchards burdened with ruddy fruit which surrounded the warm tenement of Van Tassel, his heart yearned after the damsel who was to inherit these domains. From the moment Ichabod laid his eyes upon these regions of delight, the peace of his mind was at an end, and his only study was how to gain the affections of the peerless daughter of Van Tassel. In this enterprise, however, he had more difficulties than generally fell to the lot of a knight-errant of yore. Ichabod had to put up with the heart of a country coquette, beset with a labyrinth of whims and caprices, which were forever presenting new difficulties and impediments, and he had to encounter a host of fearful adversaries of real flesh and blood. Among these, the most formidable was a burly, roaring, roistering blade of the name of Abraham, or according to the Dutch abbreviation, Bram van Brunt, the hero of the country round, which rang with his feats of strength and hardihood. He was broad-shouldered and double-jointed, with short, curly black hair and a bluff but not unpleasant countenance, having a mingled air of fun and arrogance. From his Herculean frame and great powers of limb, he had received the nickname of Bram Bones, by which he was universally known. He was always ready for either a fight or a frolic, but he had more mischief than ill will in his composition, and with all his overbearing roughness there was a strong dash of waggish good humor at the bottom. This rantipole hero had for some time singled out the blooming Katrina for the object of his uncouth gallantries, and though his amorous toyings were something like the gentle caresses and endearments of a bear, yet it was whispered that she did not altogether discourage him in his hope. Certain it is his advances were signals for rival candidates to retire, who felt no inclination to cross a lion. Such was the formidable rival with whom Ichabod Crane had to contend, and considering all things, a stouter man than he would have shrunk from the competition, and a wiser man would have despaired. He had, however, a happy mixture of pliability and perseverance in his nature. He was in form and spirit like a supplejack, yielding but tough. Though he bent, he never broke, and though he bowed beneath the slightest pressure, yet the moment it was away, he jerked up and carried his head as high as ever. To have taken the field openly against his rival would have been madness, for he was not a man to be thwarted in his amour. Ichabod therefore made his advances in a quiet and gently insinuating manner. Under cover of his character of singing master, he made frequent visits to the farmhouse. Not that he had anything to apprehend from the meddlesome interference of her parents, which is so often a stumbling block. Balt Van Tassel was an easy, indulgent soul. He loved his daughter better than his pipe, and like a reasonable man and an excellent father, he let her have her way in everything. His notable little wife, too, had nothing to do to attend to her housekeeping and manage her poultry, for as she sagely observed, ducks and geese are foolish things and must be looked after, but girls can take care of themselves. Bram, who had a rough degree of chivalry in his nature, would fain have carried matters to open warfare and settled their pretensions to the lady by single combat, but Ichabod was too conscious of the superior might of his adversary to enter into that against him. He had overheard a boast of Bones that he would double the schoolmaster up and lay him on a shelf in his own schoolhouse, and he was too wary to give him an opportunity. In this way matters went on for some time, without producing any material effect on the relative situation of the contending powers. On a fine autumn afternoon, Ichabod, in a pensive mood, sat enthroned on the lofty stool whence he usually watched all the concerns of his literary realm. Apparently there had been some appalling act of schoolhouse justice recently inflicted, where his scholars were all busily intent upon their books, or slyly whispering behind them with one eye on the schoolmaster, and a kind of buzzing stillness reigned throughout the schoolroom. It was suddenly interrupted by the appearance of a servant. He came clattering up to the school door with an invitation to Ichabod to attend a merrymaking, or quilting frolic, to be held that evening at Mynheer Van Tassel's. Ichabod immediately released his students. The gallant teacher now spent at least an extra half an hour at his toilet, brushing and furbishing up his best and indeed only suit of rusty black, and arranging his looks by a bit of broken glass that hung up in the schoolhouse. That he might make his appearance before his mistress in the true style of a cavalier, he borrowed a horse from the farmer with whom he was domiciling, a choleric old Dutchman of the name of Hans von Ripper, and thus gallantly mounted, issued forth like a knight in quest of adventure. The animal he bestrode was a broken-down plough horse that had outlived almost everything but his viciousness. He was gaunt and shagged, with a ewe-neck and a head like a hammer. His rusty mane and tail were tangled and knotted with burrs. One eye had lost its pupil and was glaring and spectral, but the other had the gleam of a genuine devil in it. Still, he must have had fire and metal in his day, if we may judge him from the name he bore of Gunpowder. Ichabod was a suitable figure for such a steed. He rode with short stirrups, which brought his knees nearly up to the pommel of the saddle. His sharp elbows stuck out like a grasshopper's. He carried his whip perpendicular in his hand like a scepter, and as his horse jogged on, the motions of his arms were not unlike the flapping of a pair of wings. It was, as I have said, a fine autumnal day. The sky was clear and serene, and nature wore that rich and golden livery which we always associate with the idea of abundance. The forests had put on their sober brown and yellow, while some of the trees of the tenderer kind had been nipped by the frost into brilliant dyes of orange and purple and scarlet. Streaming files of wild ducks began to make their appearance high in the air. The bark of the squirrel might be heard from the groves of beech and hickory nuts, and the pensive whistle of the quail at intervals from the neighboring stubble field. As Ichabod jogged slowly on his way, his eye, ever open to every symptom of culinary abundance, ranged with delight over the treasures of jolly autumn. On all sides he beheld vast stores of apples, some hanging in oppressive opulence on the trees, some gathered into baskets and barrels for the market, others heaped up in rich piles for the cider press. Farther on he beheld great fields of Indian corn, with its golden ears peeping from their leafy coverts, and holding out the promise of cakes and hasty puddings, and the yellow pumpkins lying beneath them, turning up their fair round bellies to the sun, and giving ample prospects of the most luxurious of pies. And anon he passed the fragrant buckwheat fields, breathing the odor of the beehive, and as he beheld them, soft anticipation stole over his mind of dainty flapjacks, well buttered and garnished with honey by the delicate little dimpled hand of Katrina Van Tassel. It was toward evening that Ichabod arrived at the castle of Herr Van Tassel, which he found thronged with the pride and flower of the adjacent country. Brom Bones was the hero of the scene, having come to the gathering on his favorite steed, Daredevil, a creature like himself full of mettle and mischief, and which no one but himself could manage. He was, in fact, noted for preferring vicious horses, given to all kinds of tricks, which kept the rider in constant risk of his neck, for he held a tractable, well-broken horse as unworthy of a man of spirit. I would pause to dwell upon the world of charms that burst upon the enraptured gaze of Ichabod as he entered the state parlor of Van Tassel's mansion. Such heaped-up platters of cakes of various and almost indescribable kinds, known only to the experienced Dutch housewives. There was the doughty doughnut, the tender oly cake, and the crisp and crumbling cruller, sweet cakes and short cakes, ginger cakes and honey cakes, and the whole family of cakes. And then there were apple pies and peach pies and pumpkin pies, besides slices of ham and smoked beef, and delectable dishes of preserved plums and peaches and pears and quinces, not to mention broiled shad and roasted chicken, all mingled together, higgledy-piggledy, as much as I've enumerated them, with the motherly teapot sending up its clouds of vapor from the midst. Old Baltus Van Tassel moved about his guests with a face dilated with content and good humor. And now the sound of music from the common room or hall summoned everyone to the dance. Ichabod prided himself upon his dancing as much as upon his vocal powers. Not a limb, not a fiber about him was idle, and to have seen him loosely hung, frames in full motion, and clattering about the room, you would have thought St. Vitus himself, that blessed patron of the dance, was figuring before you in person. The lady of his heart was his partner in the dance, and smiling graciously in reply to all his amorous oglings, while Brom Bones, sorely smitten with love and jealousy, sat brooding by himself in one corner. When the dance was at an end, Ichabod was attracted to a knot of the sager folks who, with old Van Tassel, sat smoking at one end of the piazza, gossiping over former times and drawing out long stories about the war. But all these were nothing to the tales of ghosts and apparitions that succeeded. The neighborhood is rich in legendary tales of the kind. The chief part of the stories turned upon their favorite specter of Sleepy Hollow, the Headless Horseman, who had been heard several times of late patrolling the country, and it was said tethered his horse nightly among the graves in the churchyard. This story was immediately matched by a marvelous adventure of Brom Bones, who made light of the galloping Hessian as an errant jockey. He affirmed that on returning one night from the neighboring village of Sing Sing, he had been overtaken by the midnight trooper, that he had offered to race with him, and that he should have won too, where Daredevil beat the goblin horse all hollow. But just as they came to the church bridge, the Hessian bolted and vanished in a flash of fire. All these tales told in that drowsy undertone with which men talk in the dark, the countenances of the listeners only now and then receiving a casual gleam from the glare of a pipe, sank deep into the mind of Ichabod. The revel now gradually broke up. Ichabod only lingered behind, according to the custom of country lovers, to have a chat with the heiress, fully convinced that he was now on the high road to success. What passed at this interview I will not pretend to say, for in fact I do not know. Something, however, must have gone wrong, for he sallied forth after no very great interval with an air quite desolate. Was her encouragement of the poor pedagogue all a mere sham to secure her conquest of his rival? Let it suffice to say, Ichabod stole forth with the air of one who had been sacking a hen-house rather than a fair lady's heart. It was the very witching time of night that Ichabod, heavy-hearted and crestfallen, pursued his travel homewards along the sides of the lofty hills which rise above Tarrytown, in which he had traversed so cheerily in the afternoon. The hour was as dismal as himself. Far below him the Tappan Zee spread its dusky and indistinct waste of waters, with here and there the tall mast of a sloop riding quietly at anchor under the land. No sight of life occurred near him, but occasionally the melancholy chirp of a cricket, or perhaps the guttural twang of a bullfrog from a marsh, as if sleeping uncomfortably and turning suddenly in its bed. All stories of ghosts and goblins that he had heard in the afternoon now came crowding upon his recollection. The night grew darker and darker, the stars seemed to sink deeper in the sky, and driving clouds occasionally hid them from his sight. He had never felt so lonely and dismal. He was, moreover, approaching the very place where many of the scenes of the ghost stories had been laid. In the center of the road stood an enormous tulip tree, which towered like a giant above all the other trees in the neighborhood and formed a kind of landmark. Its limbs were gnarled and fantastic, large enough to form trunks for ordinary trees, twisting down almost to the earth and rising again to the air. Suddenly he heard a groan. His teeth chattered and his knees smote against the saddle, but it was the rubbing of one huge bough upon another as they were swayed by the breeze. He passed the tree in safety, but new perils lay before him. About 200 yards from the tree, a small brook crossed the road and ran into a marshy and thickly wooded glen known by the name of Wiley's Swamp. A few rough logs, laid side by side, served for a bridge over this stream. On that side of the road where the brook entered the wood, a group of oaks and chestnuts matted thick with wild grapevines threw a cavernous gloom over it. To pass this bridge was the severest trial. As he approached the stream, his heart began to thump. He bestowed both whip and heel upon the starveling ribs of old Gunpowder, who dashed forward, snuffing and snorting, but came to a stand just beside the bridge with a suddenness that nearly sent the rider sprawling over his head. Just at that moment, a plashy tramp by the side of the bridge caught the sensitive ear of Ichabod. In the dark shadow of the grove, on the margin of the brook, he beheld something huge, misshapen, black, and towering. It stirred not, but seemed to gather up in the gloom, like some gigantic monster ready to spring. The hair of the affrighted pedagogue rose upon his head with terror. What was to be done? To turn and fly now was too late, and besides, what chance was there of escaping a ghost or a goblin, if such it was, which could ride upon the wings of the wind? Ichabod, who had no relish for this strange midnight companion, and bethought himself of the adventure of Brom Bones with the galloping Hessian, now quickened his steed in hopes of leaving him behind. On mounting a rising ground, which brought the figure of his fellow traveler into relief against the sky, gigantic in height and muffled in a cloak, Ichabod was horror-struck on perceiving that he was headless. But his horror was still more increased on observing that the head, which should have rested on his shoulders, was carried before him on the pommel of the saddle. His terror rose to desperation. He rained a shower of kicks and blows upon Gunpowder, hoping by sudden movement to give his companion the slip, but the spectre started in full jump with him. Away then they dashed through thick and thin, stones flying and sparks flashing at every bound. Ichabod's flimsy garments fluttered in the air as he stretched his long, lank body away over the horse's head in the eagerness of his flight. They had now reached the road which turns off Sleepy Hollow, but Gunpowder, who seemed possessed of a demon instead of keeping it, made an opposite turn and plunged headlong down the hill to the left. This road leads through a sandy hollow, shaded by trees for about a quarter of a mile, where it crosses the bridge, famous in a goblin story, and just beyond swells to the green knoll on which stands the whitewashed church. As yet, the panic of the steed had given his unskillful rider an apparent advantage in the chase, but just as he had gotten halfway through the hollow, the girths of the saddle gave way, and he felt it slip away from underneath him. An opening in the trees now cheered him with the hopes that the church bridge was at hand. "If I can just but reach the bridge," thought Ichabod, "I am safe." Just then he heard the black steed pant and blow close behind him. He even fancied that he felt its hot breath. Another convulsive kick in the ribs, and old Gunpowder sprang upon the bridge. He thundered over the resounding planks. He gained the opposite side, and now Ichabod cast a look behind to see if his pursuer should vanish according to the rules in a flash of fire. Just then he saw the goblin rise up in the stirrups in the very act of hurling his head at him. Ichabod endeavored to dodge the horrible missile, but was too late. It encountered his cranium with a tremendous crash. He was tumbled headlong to the dust, and Gunpowder, the black steed, and the goblin rider all passed by like a whirlwind. The next morning the old horse was found without his saddle, and with the bridle under his feet, soberly cropping the grass at his master's gate. Ichabod did not make an appearance at breakfast. Dinner came, but no Ichabod. Hans von Ripper now began to feel some uneasiness about the fate of poor Ichabod and his saddle. An inquiry was set afoot, and after diligent investigation they came upon his traces. In one part of the road leading to the church was found the saddle tramped in the dirt. The tracks of the horse's hooves deeply dented the road, and evidently at furious speed, were traced to the bridge, beyond which, on the bank of a broad part of the brook, where the water ran deep and black, was found the hat of the unfortunate Ichabod, and close beside it, a shattered pumpkin. The old country wives, who are the best judges of these matters, maintain to this day that Ichabod was spirited away by supernatural means, and it is a favorite story often told about the neighborhood around a wintry fire. The bridge became more than ever an object of superstitious awe, and that may be the reason why the road has been altered of late years. The schoolhouse, being deserted, fell into decay, and is reported to be haunted by the ghost of the unfortunate teacher, and a ploughboy loitering home on a still summer evening has still often fancied to hear the man's voice at a distance chanting a melancholy psalm among the tranquil solitudes of Sleepy Hollow. And that's our story. Thank you for tuning in for Crackling Tales. We hope you'll come again.